All right, joining me this week on the podcast, he is the Hall of Fame promoter, the founder of Top Rank, and one of the most knowledgeable guys in this boxing business today, the great Bob Arum. How are you, Bob?
Really good, really good. I mean, these are crazy times, but look, I'm here in LA. I got a nice backyard, a swimming pool, so what can be bad?
That's true. And I see you've got, is this the first time you've grown a beard?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I'm a guy who shaved every day, or worst, every other day, and now I'm 6 weeks into a beard.
How are you liking the beard personally?
It doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me. It sort of gives me something to look at when I get up in the morning.
But last week I had Sugar Ray Leonard on for about an hour, and we were just talking about a lot of his great moments in his fighting history. And you were part of, well, a few of them, but you were part of one in particular, the Hagler fight. What do you remember about making that fight? Because at that point, Ray had been retired for like 3 years prior to that fight.
Well, it was interesting because Marvin never wanted to fight after he fought Tommy Hearns. Marvin saved all his money, and so he was relatively well off because he didn't spend very much money. And so he wanted to retire after Hearns. Somehow we convinced him, kicking and screaming, to fight John Mugabe. And he took a postponement on that fight. And finally, it happened. It was a tremendous fight because Marvin's was slipping, and Ray was at ringside and he saw it, and that's when he decided to come out of retirement. Mm-hmm. And at first, Marvin wanted absolutely nothing to do with fighting Leonard or fighting anybody else. And I remember that I was in Boston meeting with Pat Petronelli, his manager, co-manager with his brother, and Pat's girlfriend, Betty Whitney, and driving all night with, I remember, fog and everything to get to Marvin, who was in New Hampshire. And finally, we reached where Marvin's house early one morning, and Pat said, "You and Betty sit in the car. Let me go in and talk to him." And so I remember, I'll never forget, there was Pat and Marvin drinking coffee, sitting on an outdoor table in Marvin's backyard, and suddenly Marvin starts banging his hand on the table, and really angry. And the meeting with Pat and Marvin broke up about 15 minutes later, and Marvin and Pat came back to the car. And I said, "Pat, what the hell happened? Why did he get so angry?" He said, "Bob, you'll never believe it. I was convincing him to do the Leonard fight, and he said he didn't want to do it really. And finally, I said to him, look, Goody, Pat's brother, was the trainer, and I get 1/3 of Marvin's purse, collectively 1/3. We told Marvin he took the fight, we'd cut it to 15%. And Marvin started pounding the table, yelling, "I don't know if I'm going to fight that pussy or not, but if I fight him, you're going to take the 1/3." I mean, really, Marvin is a real character, wonderful, wonderful guy. And then we ran into a problem. I was on the outs at that point with Ray's then manager, Mike Trainer. And Trainer said, the only way Ray's going to do the fight is if Top Rank and Bob Arum are not involved. And so Pat and Goody met with Marvin, and they came back and they said, and Pat said, "Mike, if Top Rank isn't the promoter, there's no fight." And finally, when Trainer realized they were serious, he said, "Okay, Top Rank can promote, but he's got to buy us out. So I bought Ray out, his share, for $11 million. And Marvin was fighting on a percentage and ended up making over 19, something that Ray will never forgive me for, but it was his own brilliant manager that caused it.
Why were you on the outs with Mike Trainer?
I don't remember. Who remembers that? Some stupid, crazy reason that that makes little sense now. Something to do with Ray. I don't know, some other fight that Ray had. I mean, I don't know which one. I don't know why, but Trainer was this. He had complete control pretty much over Ray, and it was very easy to piss Mike off. And this was just a period that he was pissed off. I later became really good friends with him, and then enemies. Mike was a prickly kind of guy.
It always seemed, and this is just me kind of reading from afar, that Marvin felt a particular kind of way about Ray Leonard. That, going back to like '84 when Leonard fought Kevin Howard, it felt like Marvin thought that he was going to get the Leonard fight then, and it just never materialized when Marvin wanted. Is there any truth to that?
Well, it was a class kind of thing. I mean, Marvin wasn't an Olympian. He was an amateur that went into the pros, and like all pros then, fought for $50, $100 a fight, had to fight the toughest guys going, found it difficult to get fights because he was so good, and he was also a southpaw. So people didn't want to fight him. And I remember King was doing a middleweight tournament, and he said that Marvin could get in if Marvin signed his life away to one of King's contracts, and Marvin refused, so he was kept out of it. And, particularly for a lot of his career, Marvin was even off my radar. The only reason I got involved with Marvin is because Senator Ted Kennedy and the Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, sent me letters that arrived the same day saying that if I didn't give Marvin a shot at the middleweight title, because I controlled the middleweight championship at that point, there would be a congressional investigation, joint House and Senate, right? So I wasn't looking for trouble. So I called my friend Rip Valenti, who was the promoter in Boston and had done a lot of closed circuit work for us. And Rip had Pat and Goody come to my office, and that's when we made the deal that I would give Marvin a 10-round fight against a very tough Argentine guy named Cabrera on the same card that Vito Antuofermo and Hugo Coro were fighting for the middleweight title. And if Marvin won that fight, he would fight the winner. And that's what happened. And Marvin then fought Vito Antuofermo. Again, what stuck in Marvin's craw on the undercard of a Sugar Ray Leonard championship fight with Leonard against Benitez for the welterweight championship. So Marvin was the undercard, won that fight clearly with Antuofermo, and the judges in Nevada, in their wisdom, called it a draw. So, and then we had Marvin stayed with us, and we gave him 3 fights that the networks show on 3 fights in Keep Busy fights in New England. And finally, we arranged for Marvin to fight Minter, and he had to go to England to fight him. And once he won the title, the Brit cascaded us with bottles of beer. It was like a war scene. So, Marvin had it tough. Now, take Sugar Ray Leonard, who was the poster boy of the United States amateurs. He was featured as an Olympic fighter. in 1976. He won against a tough Cuban, the Olympic gold medal. The ABC did the Olympics then, and Howard Cosell was the commentator, and he went berserk over Leonard. And so Leonard, by his first professional fight, was deemed the Prince Charming of boxing. And unlike Marvin, who fought for $50 and $100 in his first fights, Leonard was fighting for $50 and $100,000 in his first fights. So there was absolutely nothing to do with Ray. Ray always has been a splendid guy. He is today. But there was a great resentment that Marvin had built up, that he had worked so hard in boxing, and Leonard had his career handed to him with a silver spoon. I took that resentment, by the way, in the promotion, and I, in political terms, because I'm very political, I said, this fight is like the blue collar guy against the yuppie. They had yuppies, and I caught on. That was a very Trumpian thing for me to do, to rally the working class, right? When you didn't particularly, they were fighting for millions of dollars, so it was hardly the working class. But in any event, it caught on. It was a tremendous promotion and a very interesting fight. I thought that Marvin had won the fight, but the scorecards went against him. I mean, the problem was one judge, Lou Filippo from California, had it 7-5 for Marvin. Another judge, Moretti from Vegas, had him 7-5 for Ray. And then Suleiman's judge from Mexico, wrote his scorecard out before the fight, and he had it 10 rounds to 2 for Ray. So that really, at best, I thought it was a draw, but I thought really Marvin won that fight.
So being a promoter, you watch a fight like that, it's a close fight. I mean, you see how Hagler reacted in the ring. Are you thinking right away, let's make the rematch? I mean, what is your thought process after that fight?
Marvin told me after that fight that he had fill of boxing. Now, around a year later, I'll never forget, Caesar's Palace was doing an event, was like a tribute to boxing at Caesar's Palace. And they had Ali there and all Leonard and Hearns and Duran and Hagler. Everybody was there. We were all dressed in tuxedos. And at one point, while we, sitting around before the dinner, I was standing next to Ray. And Ray looked across the ring. He said, Bob, go over and talk to Marvin and tell him not to be a dope. Let's do the rematch. We'll make a lot of money. And so, of course, I did. I went over and I said, Marvin, I've been talking to Ray, and Ray said, you got to do the rematch. There's a fortune to be made. And Marvin looked at me at the cold way that he could look at somebody, and he says, Bob, tell Ray to get a life. And that was the end. And I knew from that point on there would be no rematch.
Incredible. When one of the consequences, I guess, of this pandemic going on is that, a lot of people spend a lot of time inside watching old fights. I mean, I've watched all those fights from the 1980s over the last, couple of weeks. And one thing I noticed, Bob, is, they were all such big events. And if you go back and you read stories, like Sports Illustrated would write these massive cover stories on all these fights and all these fighters. Contrast that with now and the way it's covered. I mean, when did you see things start to change for boxing, and what do you attribute that to?
Well, I think things changed when we all got into silos. When networks, uh, decided a HBO fighter wouldn't appear on Showtime, a Showtime fighter wouldn't appear on HBO. There were, in the '80s, while certain fighters were loyal to certain promoters, we didn't have contracts. In other words, I never had a contract for more than one, maybe two fights if I was planning a second fight with Marvin. Everything was fight to fight. That changed as we went into past the '90s, when everybody started with these long-term contracts, and with it was originally the HBO Showtime rivalry. Top Rank became an HBO supplier. Then Al Heyman with PBC, it wasn't PBC, it was Heyman. When he put Mayweather to Showtime, then Showtime became the haven for Al Heyman, which became PBC. And then later on, with Dazn, with Matchroom, they became an entity. And very rare was it that fighters went from one to the other. I remember when Eddie wanted to do the Ramirez Hooker fight on the zone, I had to go to ESPN then, which I'm providing fights to, and get permission, which they gave. The partnership in the Wilder Fury fight with Fox and ESPN and PBC and Top Rank, everybody worked collegiately to make it the event that it became. So I look forward, maybe I'm an optimist, to more cross promotions like that. And I think if we do that and we start, churning out Crawford and Spence and a lot of fighters, that a lot of fights that can be made that the public really wants to see, I think that boxing will revive and be back almost the way it was in the '80s with the Four Kings.
You said at the top of this podcast that you're looking at June, hopeful for June. Can you just tell me where you are with all that in terms of preparation? What is ESPN telling you about dates? What are the commissions that you've talked to telling you? Where are you logistically with what you can do at this point?
First of all, we're going to act responsibly. We're not cowboys like the UFC and Dana White. Not going to go ahead and say, I got to do the fight, and if people are going to get sickened and so forth, not going to do that. We're going to do it with responsible medical authorities, and we're going to do it with responsible boxing commissions. Now, we're working closely with the Nevada Commission, with the California Commission, where these people of these commissions have governors who are doing a very good job in the coronavirus. Governor Newsom in California, Governor Sisolak in Nevada. And we are setting forth how we can do these fights without audiences safely and sanely. And for example, let's assume we do these fights in Nevada. We are sanitizing and sterilizing our gym so that fighters can work in the gym. Only those fighters who are tested and are corona-free, and we will quarantine them in a hotel, because hotels are empty now in Vegas. They're beginning to open. Get a floor in the hotel, bring them in, have them eat in the restaurants at the hotel for 2-3 weeks, test them once again before the event, test the referee, the officials, the announcers, the camera people, anybody in the room. We would do it in an empty ballroom that one of the hotels would give us for that purpose. And I think in that way we could do fights, not jeopardizing anybody's health and safety. And once that we can do that, and once the commission signs off on that, then we can go to ESPN, because they don't have other sports content, live content, and schedule these events maybe 2 or 3 times a week, so that we're able to put on as many of these events as possible during the summer before we can realistically open up these events and do them like before live audiences.
Do your fighters understand the economics of fighting behind closed doors? Because I had Terrence Crawford on a few weeks back, and he said, look, you want me to fight behind closed doors, you pay me more money, which, obviously doesn't line up with the realities of the situation.
Again, some fighters have different views. And after we talk with them, if those views make it impossible to use them, next man up. Nobody in this situation is indispensable. In other words, we have like 90 fighters that fight for us. There are a lot of fighters that fight under Lou DiBella's promotion or Kathy Duva's. Fighters I envisage will be fighting for a place on these cards. If a fighter said, no, I don't want to fight without an audience, you have to pay me more, or I just don't fight, that's okay. I respect that. Next man up. Nobody is indispensable in this environment.
Mm-hmm. When you negotiate these contracts, do you have to basically scale it differently, knowing that gate revenue is not going to come in?
Of course, we will. If we have a minimum, like one of our fighters in a contract, a minimum, but we've been paying 2 and 3 times the minimum in a lot of cases. You go back to the minimum and you work out the purse. Again, nobody can force any of them to fight, and nobody can force a promoter to use them. We're going to have to use those fighters who have managers and so forth, who realize the situation that everybody is in.
Do you, as a promoter, you are part of the Fury Wilder promotional team. You have Terrence Crawford. These guys draw significant crowds, significant gates. Are you optimistic that, come the fall, that those types of events can be organized? Or is it going to be a case of, look, you either have to move your career forward or you have to wait for the 2021 maybe for top dollar?
So take a Fury Wilder fight. There's a contract for a third fight. In the second fight, the gate accounted for almost $17 million of the revenue. Now, if you do a fight without spectators, how do you account for the 17 million? Obviously, you can't. It's not magic. So I talked to Tyson Sunday, and he's very, very smart guy and is aware of the situation. And I said, Tyson, the earliest we're going to do anything with you and Wilder, is November, December, to get spectators and so forth. And he says, well, that's fine. Whatever, is possible. He's a very smart guys, and a lot of fighters are really smart guys, realize that if they have to wait an extra month or so, not the end of the world. I mean, and I talked yesterday with Eddie Hearn and his people, and Valo and John Wirt with the Pulev people. I'm part of the Pulev promotion, and we discussed that. And obviously, they had to do the fight in June. We postponed it to July, and we'll probably have to postpone it again, because I don't see how we can do the fight or how it's feasible without an audience, right? Whether the audience is in the UK or the audience is some other place outside the UK. And also, there's a major problem in boxing that has, once you solve all the testing and everything, there's a travel ban. So you can't really talk about bringing in fighters from the UK to the United States because they're not allowed here. You can't even talk about bringing in Canadians like Rivas and Alvarez and Beterbiev, who are in Canada, and we would like to feature on these shows because there's a travel ban on the border between the United States and Canada. So all of that has to be sorted out. Now, Mexican fighters, we have Burchelt and Eveready. I saw Oscar Valdez talk about he can't wait to fight Burchelt, and I can't wait to see that fight. But can we get Burchelt into the United States? He has a visa, no problem. But there's a problem at the border because the border, in effect, is closed because of this coronavirus. All of that has to be worked out. And boxing does not rule the world. Boxing is not the driving force in the dynamics today of dealing with the coronavirus. And we have to be aware of that situation. I talked today with Igis Klimas about which of his fighters that we use all the time, who have gone home to Kazakhstan or the Ukraine, and he's making a list of all of them. For example, Kavaliskis, the welterweight, would be available. He's in the United States. Votsick, the light heavyweight, would be available. He's in the United States. But again, Lomachenko, as much as we want to use him, can't bring him over here because he's in the Ukraine. He went home, obviously, when this happened, to be with his family.
You've been a global promoter, Bob, for your entire career. Do you look at this situation? Could we see big fights go to sites like the Middle East because if it's safer there, if it's safe there, the site fee obviously accounts for significant amount of money that a gate might account for.
Yeah, I mean, that's a possibility. They're on lockdown like we are. I mean, there's a travel ban in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, in Saudi Arabia. Again, yeah, but, Eddie Hearn showed with the Joshua Ruiz second fight how lucrative it could be to do an event in Saudi Arabia. A couple of questions then, Saudi Arabia is pretty much on lockdown now. But also, the price of oil is not that robust. And who knows if the Saudis will come up with major money on fights. And I was aware of this coronavirus before anybody else in boxing because we had an event scheduled for this island in China, Hunan Island, that was going to take place beginning of February for Chinese New Year. And one of the fighters, Postel and Freddie Roach, were already over there. And Ramirez was leaving that night when we decided to pull the whole thing down when it looked like this coronavirus was spreading outside of Wuhan. And we stopped Ramirez from going, and we brought Freddie and Postel back to the United States. So we were aware. We didn't realize that it would spread the way it did. We're not scientists, but we were aware of this virus before anybody else in boxing.
Well, your mayor, Bob, sounds like she's ready to open up right now.
What?
Your mayor, Carolyn Goodman, ready to open up right now.
Well, Carolyn Goodman is Carolyn Goodman. She's a very smart lady, but I think she drinks too much when she's secluded.
Hey, Bob, it's always great to talk to you. The stories are great, and I'm hoping, like you are, boxing gets back as safely as possible.
It will.